Morning, everyone. Wait, do you want to start, Hannah, or me?
No, you, Iris.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual event. Thank you for attending. We obviously hope in the future we can all be together, but as we can't right now, we're happy to host this event. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Iris Lindenbaum. I serve on the executive committee for the Fraternal Order of Bendin-Sosnowicer. I am a third generation survivor, but I am better known in this group as the grandchild of Sam and Stella Skura. It is an honor and a pleasure to share with you these two accomplished individuals that also both have a special connection to our society. Today, we will be hosting a book talk of Mel Laytner's Amazon #1 new release, What They Did Not Burn, Uncovering My Father's Holocaust Secrets. Mel is a second generation survivor. His father is from Dubrova, and Mel is a member of our society. Mel has been a long-term journalist of local and international news as a reporter and editor in New York City. He served as a foreign correspondent in London and the Middle East for NBC News and the United Press International. Stacy Sionist will be our moderator today. Stacy is a third generation survivor. Her grandfather, Jack Feldman, was from Sosnowice, as well as where my grandfather's from. Stacy is an advocate for Holocaust remembrance. She plays an integral part in many Holocaust foundations. In 2019, Stacy was a founding member for the United States Holocaust Museum's Next Generation Board. She shares her passion with her family. Stacy's grandfather, Jack, and her children were featured in the documentary, the HBO documentary, The Number on My Great-Grandfather's Arm. It is my pleasure to introduce Jack and Stacy today.
Thanks so much, Iris. Before we start our program, I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please type them into the chat and we will make sure at the end to do all of your, have Mel answer your questions. So thank you everyone for joining us. I just have to say, reading Mel's book, What They Didn't Burn, was such an amazing experience, not only to learn his father's story, but to learn about Mel's journey of how he was able to go on and corroborate all of the stories that his father had told him as he was growing up. So you are all in for a wonderful program here today to learn a little bit more about Mel and his story. So Mel, the first question I'd like to ask you is that you have a quote from your father that seems to be a theme within the book of his survival, and it relates to luck. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on this theme of luck, as I'm sure so many 2Gs and 3Gs and 4Gs have heard the same theme from their survivor relatives.
Well, what really it comes down to is, and I think a lot of us heard it from our parents, as they said, it was a matter of luck. It was just, you could be smart, you could be stupid, you could have money, you could not have money. It was a coin toss. Surviving was a coin toss. What I found, however, was the reality is much more nuanced than that. Yes, you needed luck, but you had to, as one of the people I quote in the book, you had to improve your luck. You had to be heads up. You had to be able to assess a situation and act on it or not act on it. And then the luck would come into play. And that's basically what I found with my father's actions, because he did a lot of things proactively that he never talked about. And rather than just stories, I was happy that I was able to find corroboration of those stories, both in German documents, which are really independent corroboration, as well as stories from people who knew him in the camps, in the ghettos.
Perfect. And as you speak about the corroboration, you said you heard these stories your whole life. from your father. But as you went on this journey, each piece of evidence, whether it was speaking to another survivor or finding a German document, was exciting, but it was more than exciting to you because it meant something more. Could you elaborate a little bit on that theme as well?
Yes, and I think everybody in this audience experiences and feels what I feel. Okay, we have these stories, and we tell them to our children, and we tell them to our nephews, and we tell them to our nieces, and those of us who are fortunate enough may even tell them to our grandchildren. But they're stories. And over time, stories become family lore, not family fact. And over time, I'm thinking of generations ahead, these will become legends. So when I started tripping over this timeline of independent corroboration, I thought, well, this changes it from family law to family fact. And I wanted to show the reader just how much is out there and how much is available. And frankly, now it's a lot easier because so much of what I spent hours and days and trips digging out of archives have been put online. And it's much easier than it has been in the past. So I found altogether, I think my last count was 23 individual German documents that tracked my father from basically the spring of 1942 to April 1945. And they match his timeline through the war. And that was on one level. On another level, the documents themselves are critical because the timeline shows the evolution of Nazi policy from ethnic cleansing to mass murder. You can recognize the gradual shift by the documents themselves. They tell the story.
Thank you. And I know that, could you speak to us a little bit about Bill Ball? As in my opinion, this is kind of how your research began. And so I think it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more about him.
Okay, so one of the favorite family stories, and one that sort of that I kept and I told my kids about, that my father told me, was that he was working in the Blechhammer oil refineries, and there were British POWs who were also working there, building the refineries. And this one POW, British POW named Bill Ball, to my recollection, used his privilege as a POW. They had privilege that they could write postcards home. Bill Ball used this privilege to send a postcard to my father's sister, who was living in Brooklyn, New York. She had immigrated to the United States in 1931. And my father's mother, actually, he got her out of Poland right before the war in 38, a year before the war in 38. And my father told me that the postcard could only say something because of censorship. The postcard could only say something, I'm doing as well as can be expected. My mate Joe is still with me. Okay, so when it came time for me to try to get back into writing, I said, this is a good basic story. This is the type of story that, you know, it has POWs, it has drama. Let's run with this and I'll write a nice piece of fiction, because that's what I do, right? I write. Okay. And then I said, I need a little bit of background. I need a little bit of context. Where was this camp? What was it called? You know, all vague up here. My father had passed away 20 years earlier. And when I started looking into it, I immediately got confirmation of that he was at Blechhammer. His tattoo number was within a range, and I can get to that in a moment. And that there were about a few thousand British POWs at Blechhammer too. And that started it off. So Bill Ball, tracking down the story of Bill Ball, quickly or over a period of a few months, evolved very quickly into something that was nonfiction and something that was based in fact. And whenever I could demonstrate how this happened, whenever you're ready.
Yes, I was going to say, could you talk about some of the different resources you used and maybe show us some of the types of documents you found? So I think that's the perfect.
Sure. First of all, I had a lot of help along the way from researchers and from people in museums. I had help from Bill Connolly, who's retired, and another researcher, Scott Miller, from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I had an email from a cousin who was the keeper of the family tree that there were some German documents that he once saw, and Bill and Scott tracked down the first aha Eureka moment. And I'll see if this screen share works. Host has disabled participant screen sharing. Jeremy? Are you there?
Go ahead. Yes, you're able to share?
It says host has disabled participant screen sharing. Okay,
All right.
well, we can talk about it, or you can tell me that it's working. Okay, there we go. I'm going to share it. Okay. It's this piece of paper right here. This is the Auschwitz registration form when Blechhammer became a subcamp of Auschwitz. Blechhammer became the second largest labor camp within the Auschwitz archipelago of camps, and it was the largest exclusively Jewish labor camp. Okay, so you open up the envelope and this document pops out. And after you catch your breath, you go, what? And here we see on the lower left corner, my father's signature. Over here in the upper right corner is Auschwitz tattoo number. Now this document then becomes a resource, and you have to use it to look up more information. For example, over here is the date of his arrest, June 23rd, 1943. And this is where he was arrested, in Shermashitsa. And this is the street address, which when I gave this document to a professional translator to have it translated properly, she wrote this as Luge, L-O-U-G-E Street number 40. That becomes critical later in the book. And then, of course, you have all of this material, which describes him physically. His height, the shape of his ears, the shape of his mouth, and so on. Whether he was guilty of any criminal acts or criminal political acts, fine. So on one piece of paper, my father's life is reduced, right there, everything. And from this piece of paper, you start making inquiries for other sources. I now had that he was registered in the Auschwitz, so I wrote to the Auschwitz Museum. And it took almost a half a year. And then I received 3 pieces of paper. I'm only going to show you 2 of which, because we're on a time limit. Here we have a report, a confession. My father's signature is on the bottom of this confession. And in this confession, he's confessing to selling 15 diamonds at the work area in the Blechhammer refinery to a Pole. 15 diamonds. Well, where the hell does a concentration camp prisoner get a hold of 15 diamonds? And it says over here on this confession that he was going to use the money for the diamonds to buy food. And he says that the diamonds he received 500 Reich marks, and though they were worth 1,500 Reich marks. And there's the signature of the SS officer. Notice there's no date. And over here it says that the main file is at Gestapo headquarters at Heidelberg. Okay, this is pretty amazing. Dad mentioned diamonds in passing, like when he pulled his back out and he used what he called a very tiny diamond to bribe the orderly in the infirmary so he could stay there for a week, and he got back rubs every day until he could stand straight. The point of the story wasn't the diamonds. The point of the story was the risk, because the Gestapo or the SS would come in unannounced and clear everybody out of the infirmary and send them to the gas chambers at Birkenau, which is about 35 miles away. And then he would invoke that moral of all of his stories. So you see, son, it didn't matter if you had money or if you didn't, if you were smart or stupid, you needed luck. Okay, got it. And then underneath this piece of paper was this piece of paper. Let me see if I can get this thing to work. Okay, and this was another Eureka moment. This says Melding, report. I'll save you the time. It does recall the 15 diamonds that he got 500 Reich marks that he was going to spend for food. And then it says, in connection with this prisoner was found a forged railway ID card in the name of Feder Chilik. Therefore, the suspicion was aroused that this prisoner, my father, was the go-between. I ask for the strongest possible punishment of this prisoner. Well, this was a very strange shock. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, like a lot of us, I imagine, we asked our dad, well, why didn't you run away? Why didn't you escape like in the movies? And of course, there were good reasons. For one thing, this was Germany, not Poland. For another thing, his head was shaved. He had numbers on his arms. He was wearing striped pajamas. It wasn't that easy. But then he says, I did try to escape. I said, you did try to escape? He goes, yeah. You remember Chilik Feder? Sure. Chilik was a childhood friend, friend of my dad's. He installed telephones for Ma Bell in the 1950s. He says, well, Chilik had a friend he met at the Baustelle, the workplace, who had connections with the Polish underground. I had connections with British POWs. So they got a photograph, they got photographs. Chilik got the photographs to his friend in the Polish underground. They were going to make these ID cards. The ID cards would be smuggled back to the Baustelle, to the refinery. My father would buy clothes from Polish workmen, and they would escape. One problem. The Gestapo raided the forgery shop, and they found Chilik's ID card, but they didn't find my father's ID card. My father says they tracked it back to Blechhammer. They arrested or picked up Chilik. They tortured him. He implicated my father. My father says he acted stupid. He didn't know anything about it. And they had no proof. And they sent Chilik to Auschwitz to be executed. And Dad said how he escaped death is another story, his story. And that was basically the story that I remember from when I was a kid. And here we have a document that essentially confirms his story. Not confirmed by Chilik, who has since passed away, but confirmed by the Nazis themselves. And then I started thinking, well, let me back up. When I got this, I said, it's no longer an article, a long form piece of journalism. This now is a book, because I thought of all of the other survivors and all of their amazing stories, and how over time, future generations are going to look at these stories, these testimonials, and they'll say, memory is strange. He probably exaggerated here, exaggerated there. It's just natural. And here I have independent corroboration of a very important story, his story. So this was great, but how come they didn't execute my dad? What happened? Well, some months later, I was watching TV and I was bored with the Law and Order rerun. And I turned to my computer. I typed in my father's Polish spelling of his name, which I had done several times. And this time a story pops up from the Jerusalem Post about a series of documents that the Ghetto Fighters Museum in Israel has in Nahariya. And the one, and you know how Google shortens, you know, when you search Google, it shortens the return. And it said Dulek Laytner, or Joseph Laytner, received 25 lashes for selling 15 diamonds. I got in touch with the museum director and he sent me this document. This is a two-sided document. This is side number one. This is a sentencing report. It's dated June 13th. It has my father's tattoo number here. It has the date of the offense over here. It has his birth date, his name, and again, the 15 diamonds. And it makes an oblique reference without actually accusing him, but it says in connection with this prisoner, again, we found this forged ID card for the railroad. And you can see it's all very official. It's all stamped, the type of arrest, he's a Yuda, and so on and so forth. Now, we flip to the back side of the document. This is the reverse side of the document. Over here, we have a box. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 25's initial. Number of strokes. My father was sentenced to 25 lashes. He never talked about this. I'd never heard about this. It is a bit of a sobering moment when you come across something like this. And here it is with the nice Gothic type fonts and the stamps and the initials. And then here on the lower part, it says the sentence was carried out and the SS ranked officers crossed out and it says Afflinga, prisoner. And it was carried out on June 29th, 1944 by this prisoner, Joseph Brassam. Joseph Brassam. And then I have to say, if you're trained as a reporter, you turn off emotion. It's back to the races. Those of you who've read the book know that I tracked down and I reconstructed Joseph Brassam's life from documents and interviews. Documents I found in Germany, in Holland, because he was Dutch Jew, and interviews with a writer who wrote a book in Belgium, and survivors from Mill Basin, Brooklyn, to Los Angeles, to Florida. But the deeper I got into his life, the more complicated the story becomes of a couple. And that's chapter 12 of the book. Anyway, I don't want to go on much more. I just wanted to share with you a taste of what I pulled together. And there are documents of equal drama that are at least equally as significant because of the context of the time of when they're dated and where they took place.
Thank you, Mel. Would you be able to explain to people who might want to do research like you've done in your amazing book, what some of the easiest resources to use were and maybe some of the more difficult resources?
Well, I think probably everybody here uses Jewish Gen and the Shtetl books. That's already advanced research, okay? Because it's not as well indexed as it could be. I found, well, today you can get onto the International Tracing Service and they have digitized huge amounts of records, especially files from Buchenwald, which is one of the camps my father was at. And you can search. I actually have a link on my website, mellaytner.com or mellaytnerauthor.com. And there's a tab that says Holocaust research, and it lists several and gives you some hints of how to use different online research. Now, some of the most significant documents, you got to put in the shoe leather. You got to go there. You got to look at it. You got to hold it. You got to try to figure out what it means, where it leads. For example, a lot of the material you'll find online from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC are not so much documents, but finding aids, indexes and descriptions of different archives. They don't have all of those archives online. So then, I mean, I spent a lot of quality time in the stacks in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I have a friend, I used to crash in their guest room in DC. I'd get there when the museum opened. I might have a break for lunch. I'd leave there when the museum closed, and I'd do it again the next day. And then I have to go back to Manhattan to go to work. And I might be the only person who's been to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, I don't know, half a dozen times. I've never actually toured the museum. I've never seen the actual exhibits of it. I didn't have the time. And another confession, and Yad Vashem, the same thing. I can't tell you the hours and hours to go through their archives, page by page, and try to divine what's important and how it links up. And in some ways, Yad Vashem is not that well organized for an archivist. They're a huge vacuum cleaner. In the book, I point out on 2 occasions, one a photograph and one another document, I believe. They couldn't tell me where they got it from. They have it in their archive, but they don't know where they got it. Because in the early days of Yad Vashem, they just sucked in everything they could, and they eventually they digitized it. But the source, did they get this from Dachau? Did they get this photograph from, who, how? And when you get into the weeds of these things and you're trying to write a reliable history, something that nobody reasonably will question, these little sourcing things become very frustrating.
Thank you. One of the other themes that you spoke about in your book is kind of the dichotomy of what you thought your father, what you thought you knew about your father growing up and who he was as a person. And then through all of your research, who you learned your father to be. And I thought that was really interesting if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, that gets into the personal, but when I was growing up, Dad was a quiet, self-effacing, retiring, type B personality. My mother was the Magyar. She was the hot-tempered one. She was the type A personality, and Dad was retiring. We'd have friends over. All my parents' friends were survivors, and eventually, the chatting and the food and the men would play poker and the women would play 7-card knock rummy, and there was a lot of laughs and this and that. Dad would go to the living room because the games were played in our dining room table. Dad would go to the living room and pick up his Yiddish newspaper or his Reader's Digest or whatever he had in hand, and it drove Mom crazy, and it wasn't for him. It wasn't for him. Okay. And this is how I felt about him until I started my research. And after he passed away in 2005, I met an old friend of his who was a central character of the book, a French artist named Walter Spitzer. You can Google him. He's quite accomplished, or was. The first thing Walter tells me is, your dad was a bastard. I go, what? Yeah. And he explained. And then I couldn't carry on the research, but when I picked it up and I found all of this stuff and I spoke to other people, it turns out, as I said in the beginning, he was very, very active. And I have found evidence, as well as interviewed people, who said that he was a black market ringleader. This incident with the diamonds that I pointed out, there were more, and I have German documents to back it up because he was caught a second time. And he was clearly not a follower. He was proactive. He was a different kind of man. And when you're a kid, you don't see that. Your parents are your parents. He was a loving dad. But I realize in retrospect that he was suffering from depression for most of my childhood, probably into my adulthood. And he had some form of PTSD, as I think all of our parents did, and our relatives. And this, to me, now, oh yeah, sure, how could you think otherwise? Well, I got to tell you, it was a Eureka moment when it hit me during my research. I said, holy shit, pardon my language. I did not know him as a man. I loved him as a father, but I didn't really appreciate what he went through as a man and how the war bent him and how it took a generation almost until he could unbend, which I think he eventually did.
Thank you. And kind of going with, your story about the cards and the games and the gambling, there's a quote that you also talk about in the book where you say survival was a game of solitaire, not bridge. And I think that that's something a lot of people can relate to as well. Could you expand a little bit on that concept as well?
Sure. So you do research, and I found serendipitously, by viewing a testimonial in Yale, and those days you had to go up to Yale to view the testimonials because it was on VHS tapes, to view the testimony on Yale. And I tracked down this guy who, and eventually I flew down to Florida to interview him and someone else who, like my father, was a welder in Blechhammer. And I said, okay, for one guy, I may not go down to Florida, but for two guys, bingo, I'm gone. And so I sat down with them, and finally, okay. And it turns out they didn't have any real recollection about my father at all. They really didn't know anything. They kind of knew the name and this and that, but they couldn't tell me anything specific. And one of them, Mark Beck, who was from Dumbrava also. His father, he was from Dumbrava, right? And Mark told me, look, when you were in Blechhammer, when you were there, you only focused on your own survival. It was a jungle. You really didn't care what the next guy was doing. And I reflected on that, and I remembered that this artist friend of my father, he told me a story or two, but he couldn't tell me anything more. And he laughed at me. He said, what do you think? I was busy worrying about your dad. I was worrying about myself. And my own dad told me when I was a kid, and I recalled this also, he said that the Germans treated us like workhorses. And like workhorses, we wore blinders. We didn't look left, we didn't look right, only straight ahead for our own needs. And as you go through the testimonials, if you get into them, you see that is a recurring theme. It's also a recurring theme if you read POW testimonials for British POWs. Survival depended on yourself. And you could form alliances and you had friends. My mother was part of a group when she was in Birkenau that had a circle of friends. But basically, you didn't get too close. And it was a game of solitaire. And the line I like in the book, if I could tout it, is that, you know, the rules were very harsh. Winners got to play again tomorrow, losers did not. And that to me was also a sort of a realization that if I expected to find a gold mine of memories and stories by tracking down these fellow survivors, I better get a reality check. It wasn't going to happen.
Thank you. So I know, and this will be the last question, then I'll open it up to everybody else who has questions. So please make sure you put any questions in the chat. But I know, you mentioned that you feared that one day the Holocaust or certain camps could be forgotten. But later on in the book, you say that there's several things which have given you hope that this is not going to be the case. And so I wondered if you could speak to that.
Okay, I went back to Poland for the last time or the third time in 2015, and it was 9 years since I had been there. And I went back because the Auschwitz Museum was giving this artist, Walter Spitzer, a one-man show. And I had postponed my trip when I heard about this one-man show. And then I went there, and I had to go back because as you review material, you realize that things you missed that you should have been cognizant of, and things that you did see that you really didn't absorb properly. And when you get down to the fact checking, all of this matters. Little things. Okay, so there's Walter Spitzer being honored with a one-man show. He is guest of honor also at a symposium about art in Auschwitz. And there maybe, if anybody has been to Auschwitz knows, there's an auditorium off the main building of Auschwitz I, and it has maybe 300-400 seats, and it was packed, mostly with millennial age young Poles. And Walter stands about 5'4", and he was being, engulfed by all these people who wanted his autograph and wanted to shake his hand and this and that. Okay, from there, I had worked with a researcher. We went to, I had heard that in Dombrova, a survivor through a foundation had, and with the cooperation of City Hall, had put plaques on buildings and houses that used to be owned by Jews who were no more. And I'd heard that my grandfather's house was one of those, and I went there, and there it was, a plaque with my half uncle's name on it, the old street address, Pilsudskiego 3, and it said coal wholesaler and retail, coal agent, wholesaler and retail. Okay, that was an interesting feeling because when I was there the first two times, the building was decrepit and falling apart. It was a very large mansion, or sort of like a mansion that my grandfather had. Put it this way, it was cut into 14 different apartments, so it was pretty big. And from there, I went to Shermashitsa, which I had been to, but I had discovered a mistake in my research, and I wanted to go back and see if I could correct it. And originally, one of the Judenrat buildings had stood there. It was falling apart. It was just a wreck. and there was this pathetic little blue sign on it. And I went back there, and now the building is gone. The whole area, the footprint of the building is a large, open, grassy area. And up front near the corner, it's on a corner, not middle of a block, is a very modern, respectful memorial with a plaque only in Polish, commemorating the site and the ghetto with a little Magen David on it. And that was that. And then from Schermerschitz, I went back to Blechhammer, which I hadn't been to in a while. And lo and behold, and in my first time I was there and the second time I was there, it was a very depressing experience because, there's a memorial there. They kept the crematorium there. It's basically one area of an open field, and the rest of it has been reclaimed by the forest, and just didn't seem much. And now I go back, and there's a huge sign in 5 languages telling you to, tune in your app that they have on your cell phone to stop 501, and it tells you the story of Blechhammer in French, German, Italian, Polish, and English. And so taken together, I had some more hope that there's a recognition in Poland that it isn't all one-dimensional. And I have to say that the Polish people that I've met and that I worked with, who are, again, largely younger generation, people in their 30s and 40s, were very different and very helpful and very respectful. And one of them, Edward Hadu, has done work that we'd all be proud of to do. He mounted a exhibit about the Blechhammer camp in his local library, where he got the Auschwitz Museum to lend him a replica of the striped uniforms. And he's lectured to schools in his area. And he and a friend put together on the web, a sort of 3-dimensional animation of the Blechhammer camp, and where it stops, where it shows a photograph of what it looks like today, and then it flashes to what it looked like in 1945. This guy isn't Jewish, So I'm not fooling myself. I mean, I know the history of the Jews in Poland. My father used to tell me that anti-Semitism, they drank anti-Semitism with their mother's milk, except he was a little bit more graphic about it. But we should also know that there are countervailing forces as well, and not just dismiss everybody and everything. I hope that answers it, Stace.
That's perfect. Thank you. So we have some questions. The first is, during your research, was there one particular discovery that shocked you the most?
Not one, because I have the ability to be pleasantly or surprised repeatedly. The first document, the Auschwitz registration form with my father's signature, of course, is stunning. The sentencing reports, or that was amazing. I found work lists which basically revealed how he escaped deportation, what he was doing. I found pieces of paper that helped me track down which camps he went to that he didn't talk about. I found him on his name on death march lists. So there were multiple Eureka moments that came together. It wasn't just one. Yeah, when I found the first one, that was great. When I found the third one, oh, this can't be beat. When I found the 18th one, I can't believe I'm finding this stuff. And I actually even recently came across through Edward a photograph of the head of that Heidelberg Gestapo office, the one that the file was in. And this guy, who was the chief of the Gestapo office at Heidelberg, is probably the guy who interviewed Chilik Feder and my father. And I have a copy of his Gestapo ID card. I just got that last month. So, you know, stuff keeps coming up.
You may have to write a second book with the new discoveries.
It is so bizarre how this guy came. It's another Zoom session.
Okay, the next question in the chat says, can you tell us about how you discovered the story of the 100 women who had 2 numbers tattooed on their arms, including my mother, Rose Simbernoff, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Flauner?
Yeah. Hannah, I spoke to your mom about it because I was looking for confirmation. Okay, in Yad Vashem, okay, back up. In the 1970s, I believe, the German government reopened investigations into war crimes of certain Blechhammer guards. And they asked the Israeli Police Department for cooperation. And the Israeli Police Department took down testimonials, well, more like, not testimonials, more like affidavits from maybe 30 or 40 Blechhammer survivors in German. And you could tell they had certain questions they had to ask. And they all basically answered the same questions specifically about guards. Well, the folders amount to 2 folders like that thick, I mean, 5 inches thick, 2 of them. And within this, 1,000 pieces of paper, I found a testimonial from Karl Demmer, who was the Judenaltester, the head Jew in charge of, in the Blechhammer camp. The Germans would appoint a Judenaltester or a Lageraltester to run things inside the wire with his own staff. This way they could leverage very few guards to take care of a huge population. They didn't have to have a lot of troops. It was the responsibility of the Jews to police themselves, so to speak, at Blechhammer. Karl Demmerer wrote a testimonial about his own life, and someone was kind enough to translate it into English. And it's a 13-page single-spaced testimonial. And in it, one of the stories he relates is the story of he had heard that 102 women were given duplicate tattoo numbers as women in the main Auschwitz camp. And so the SS solution was very simple: eliminate them. And he approached and he pulled together material. I don't want to give the entire story away. I want people to buy the book, but he bribed the commandant, and the commandant arranged for tattooists to come and give 102 women different tattoo numbers. So I read this and I go, well, that's quite a story. Prove it. Hannah's mom, who I'd interviewed earlier, I called her up. Yeah, she had it. The first one was crossed off. She remembered the number. And I spoke to another survivor, Yaja Hammer, who was a teenager there, and she confirmed it too. So you achieve what you try to achieve as a journalist. You get independent corroboration for every assertion. There were other stories that were great stories. I mean, you know, really Hollywood quality stories that I couldn't get corroborated, and they're not in the book because I couldn't get them corroborated at all. I got hints, I got suggestions, but I couldn't get that smoking pistol.
Thank you.
Next, any other questions?
Yes, there's two more. So how did the Poles react to your being in Poland while you were doing your research?
Well, I had set up the people who I was working with before I got to Poland, through the good offices of Jeff Simbler and other people. I then met other Poles through them. There's Edward Hader, I met serendipitously when I was at Blechhammer on my first tour, and he and another fellow, we exchanged emails like you do, and we stayed in touch. And the other guy whose name I'm sorry just eludes me, Blechhammer became a strategic target. The refineries became a strategic target for the US 15th Air Force. And coincidentally, when the US 15th Air Force was bombing the refineries, those were the missions that they were taking them right over Auschwitz, that people have criticized the United States for not bombing the gas chambers, or at least the rail lines. So, but when I started looking into this thing for the 15th Air Force, it turns out America doesn't have a comprehensive list of the number of missions or the number of casualties. And this fellow put together a list from different reports. And basically the US lost 150 airplanes in over 17 missions over Blechhammer over 6 months. Well, none of that is really in the book because it got away, but this other Polish guy was extremely helpful with that and other things. And Edward has been very helpful. And other people I've met in Poland, except for some bureaucrats who were following the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law, were helpful as well. So I didn't experience any negative experiences other than the type of experience you might find if you went down to the Motor Vehicles Bureau without the proper ID and you're trying to get something done.
Thank you. And the last question is, how did your mother react to the research and book?
My mother passed away before I started. My father passed away in '85. My mother passed away in '92. My mother, unlike my father, my mother never spoke of the war. Her stories of the war would fill 4 or 5 sentences. And based on those 4 or 5 sentences, I did some research, which is in the book. And then decades later, I came across 3 friends who were with her, and they became a tight-knit group from Birkenau right through liberation. She was Hungarian, so she was arrested in May 1944 and survived, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be here.
Thank you. Those are the last questions in the chat, but I just want to encourage everyone to purchase Mel's book. I have to tell you, I've read almost every Holocaust, book out there that's perfect out there. And this book is so unique in the fact that not only do you learn these unbelievable stories about his father, but you also learn how it is Mel, you follow his journey of how he finds all of this evidence and corroborates the entire story. And so it's just absolutely fascinating. And I encourage everyone to go on to either Amazon to purchase it or on Mel's website or the other retailers, which are listed here in our chat.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope it was worthwhile.
Well, thank you both for being here today. Thank you everyone for coming. Both of your passion on the subject really shines through. We appreciate this and know the importance, both as second and third generation, of telling stories and your book is really important and so well written. So thank you. And as Stacy said, it's not a question of if, it's how fast you're going to go press and buy that book right now. So we're going to see the sales go up by the 25 people, and I expect it within an hour. Parents, your grandparents will be happy. And you know, you won't get yelled at if you don't buy the book. So you will buy it. And I think I really appreciate your time, both of you. If you're interested in learning more, I also put all the links in the chat of how to reach Mel and how to buy the book. And also, if you are interested, if you're not a member, interested in becoming more involved in the society, I left our email address in the chat, which is fobs18@gmail.com. Again, more Nachas points granted for becoming involved. We appreciate your time and really thank you both. So thank you everyone for coming today.
And leave reviews on Amazon, please. It helps with the algorithm. Really need it. Okay.
Reviews and purchases, and we will be having another event hopefully in the winter. So check your emails and join us again. And thank you all. Have a good rest of your weekend.